Deficit occurs when expenditure exceeds income or receipt. In public finance, deficit shows the financial health of a government and help assess how well resources are being managed. Understanding the different types of deficit is essential for analyzing government budgets, fiscal discipline, and economic stability. In India, deficits are commonly discussed in the context of the union budget and are closely watched by the economic policymakers and competitive exam aspirants. Types of deficit. Types of deficit refer to different ways of measuring the gap between government income and expenditure. Each type of deficit highlights a specific aspect of fiscal or external imbalance in an economy. Commonly discussed deficits include revenue deficit, fiscal deficit, primary deficit, budget deficit, trade deficit, and current account deficit, all of which help access economic stability and policy effectiveness. Revenue deficit. Revenue deficit arises when the government's revenue expenditure exceeds its revenue receipt in a financial year. It indicates that the government is not able to meet its routine expenses from its regular income. A high revenue deficit reflects poor fiscal quality and increased dependence on borrowing. Formula: revenue deficit equal to revenue expenditure minus revenue receipt. Shows borrowing for consumption rather than asset creation. Include expenses like salaries, subsidies, pension, and interest. Leads to reduction in capital expenditure. Increases public debt without productive returns. Negatively affects long-term economic growth. Fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit represents the total borrowing requirement of the government in a year. It shows the gap between total expenditure and total non-borrowed receipt. Fiscal deficit is the most important indicator of a government's financial health. Formula: fiscal deficit equal to total expenditure minus revenue receipt plus non-debt capital receipts. Reflects overall fiscal imbalance. High fiscal deficit increase inflationary pressure, leads to higher interest burden in future, affect investor confidence and credit rating, indicates extent of government borrowing from market. Primary deficit. Primary deficit is the fiscal deficit after excluding interest payment on the past borrowing. It shows the current year's fiscal position without the burden of old debt. It helps assess whether new borrowing is being controlled. Formula: primary deficit equal to fiscal deficit minus interest payments. Measures stress borrowing needs. Zero primary deficit means borrowing only for interest, indicates effectiveness of fiscal reforms. Lower primary deficit reflect better fiscal discipline, useful for long-term debt sustainability analysis. Budget deficit. Budget deficit occurs when total budget expenditure exceeds total budget receipt. It is a traditional measure of deficit used earlier in India. Due to its limited analytical value, it is no longer emphasized. Formula: budget deficit equal to total expenditure minus total receipt. Does not differentiate borrowing sources, gives a broad picture of financial imbalance, less useful for modern fiscal analysis. Replaced by fiscal deficit in budget documents, has limited relevance in current policy decisions. Trade deficit. Trade deficit arises when a country's imports of goods are greater than its export. It reflects imbalance in international trade of merchandise. A persistent trade deficit affects foreign exchange reserves. Trade deficit equal to imports minus export, leads to outflow of foreign currency, indicates dependence on imported goods, can weaken domestic manufacturing, not always harmful of imports if imports support growth. Impact balance of payment. Current account deficit. Current account deficit occurs when a country's current account payments exceed its current account receipt. It includes trade in goods, services, income and transfer. CAD reflects the external sector vulnerability of an economy. CAD equal to current account payments minus current account receipt. Includes trade deficit and net service payments. High current account deficit increases dependence on foreign capital, affects exchange rate stability, makes economy vulnerable to global shocks, closely monitored by policymakers. Effective revenue deficit. Effective revenue deficit is the revenue deficit after excluding grants for creation of capital assets. It shows the actual revenue gap without considering productive revenue expenditure. It highlights the true burden on government finances. Effective revenue deficit equal to revenue deficit minus grants for capital assets. Gives clearer picture of fiscal quality, encourages asset creating expenditure, improves budget transparency, useful for evaluating developmental spending, reduces overestimation of revenue deficit.